Francis Leach from ABC Grandstand joins us now from our studio in Melbourne. And Francis, this has clearly saddened so many people there. But for those that perhaps didn't know Phil Walsh so well, what can you tell us about him?
Well, John, his career in the AFL started as a player with Collingwood back in the early 80s, where he was Rookie of the Year, I think, in 1983. Played at Richmond for a couple of seasons, was a pioneer with the Brisbane Bears in their first season in 1987. Won the best and fairest there as that club went on to become the Brisbane Lions. And then embarked on a coaching career at Geelong, where he was a fitness coach. He spent the better part of 10 years at Port Adelaide, with Mark Williams helping them to win the 2004 premiership, and in between times with the West Coast Eagles and John Worsfold as well. Then back to Port Adelaide last year, and then the job at Adelaide, which he'd always dreamed of getting. He was probably one of the oldest coaches at their first appointment as an AFL coach in a very long time. Such was his apprenticeship. But his dream and his passion was to be an AFL coach, and for 12 weeks he got to live that dream until the tragic circumstances of last night. So you get a sense from that just how wide Philip's influence had stretched over the generations and across the continent, and that's why it's probably more deeply felt than ever before, that his loss.
And Francis, it seems as well that age difference, the fact that Phil Walsh was in his mid-50s by the time he was running the coaching side of a club like this, added to the sense that he was something of an inspiring sort of father figure to a lot of the players.
He's extremely intense, and those of us who interviewed him over a long period of time always had that sense about Phil Walsh. I didn't know him personally, I just knew him as a football coach that I interviewed, and we loved talking to him, particularly in the last little while as he became an AFL coach, and sometimes we used to make fun of some of the things he said because he could be extremely intense, but determinedly passionate about the game. It consumed him in a way that he was aware was probably out of kilter with what his needs and responsibilities were outside of the game. He spoke about that candidly throughout this year, coming to terms with all of that. But we loved his passion for the game, his insight to the game. Even last weekend we made fun of the fact that he was making references to Van Gogh's sunflowers in one of his post-match press conferences and wanting his players to paint masterpieces. Such was his sort of vision for what he did, and he used to refer to himself as the simple old bogan from Hamilton in Victoria, but he was much more than that. He was a really determined, passionate, funny, and extremely sincere person.
Francis, of course, so much that we don't yet know as to why this happened in the early hours of this morning. We do know his son has been now charged with murder, so we have to be careful with what we say at this point, clearly. But how do you think the circumstances around this, the suddenness of it, the violence of it, what sort of impact is that going to have on the club and the AFL?
Well, I think the ramifications are wider than that, and I think over the next week or two we will see a sharper focus once again on the issue of family violence and what it means, not just for this particular story, because sadly this story is one that we hear on the news once a week, somewhere around the country, sometimes more than once a week. This story is repeated over and over and over again, and it's an issue that won't go away and can't be wished away. I think that's the longer term ramifications of what we've heard today. For the Adelaide Crows, as you heard there is no rule book. The game on Sunday with Geelong has been rightfully cancelled. That couldn't have gone ahead. The demands on the players at this particular stage are just too great, and they shouldn't be expected to do anything other than mourn, and rightfully so. I think the AFL struck the right balance, though, because one of the beauties of sport is that it does go on. The show goes on, and that's part of the eternal attraction of any kind of sport. And I think we will see some very heartfelt and very poignant moments tonight at the MCG, in Darwin tomorrow night when the West Coast Eagles play Melbourne, and elsewhere around the country, as the emotion and the grief is very palpable at those particular venues. So it's going to be a very difficult weekend for all involved in AFL football. And I think if those who know sporting clubs, whether they're professional or not in general, know the camaraderie, the sense of community that sporting clubs have, whether they're professional or not, and what it means to have lost somebody in this particular role who's had such an impact on so many lives.
Finally, Francis, obviously it makes all the sense in the world to cancel this weekend's game, but it doesn't. The sport doesn't stop. Training is back on Monday or Tuesday for those players, and they've got to prepare for next weekend's round. How difficult is that going to be?
Look, I can't imagine. I don't know how they'll be able to do it, to be perfectly honest. How do you put what has occurred into a context that allows you to put yourself under such mental and physical stress to perform as a professional athlete in one of the most demanding contact sports in the world? Carrying that burden, I have no idea. But they're going to have to at some point, because you have to get back on the bike at some point, and the longer they leave it, probably the more difficult it's going to get. But it's going to be extremely difficult.